Welcome to the Ipsos Politics Talk podcast. My name is Keiran and Pedley. Well, it feels like it's back to school in more ways than one this week, with party conference season rapidly approaching. So we're going to take some time to look at the numbers and try and understand what it all means as we approach Keir Starmer's first party conference as Prime Minister. And I'm delighted to be joined, as ever, by senior politics researcher at Ipsos, Holly Day. Holly, welcome.
Thank you.
And our guest this week, Stephen Bush, Associate Editor and Columnist at the FT. Stephen, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
So, as I say, back to school. We had a few months with the government now, Holly. We've been tracking not so much voting intention at this stage, but favourability towards the government, what people think about it. Where's the public at?
So in terms of the numbers at the moment, we released our first political pulse last week, and it actually showed the highest levels of unfavourability that we've tracked for Keir Starmer since he became leader of the Labour Party, which I think is quite a significant moment going into conference season. We also have some data out this week that shows 3 times as many people are telling us they think he's doing a bad job, as told us that immediately after the general election, which he obviously won, and fresh disappointment as well, because half of the public are telling us they're disappointed in the job that the Labour government is currently doing. They've been in the job for 3 months now, so I think that figure will concern the party, and what will concern them further is that 26% of Labour voters themselves who voted this party into government are telling us they're disappointed in the job that the government are currently doing for them. So not much of a honeymoon period, if you could even call it that, with everything that's been going on, but certainly 3 data points there that won't be pleasing to the party and to the leadership.
And that Labour number is a number we'll be tracking very closely, isn't it? I mean, we spent the last 5 years talking about 2019 Conservative voters all the time, didn't we? Because that was the coalition that brought Boris Johnson's majority. But this is obviously an important group of voters for us to look at.
It is, yeah, particularly on those unfavourability numbers that I was talking about from our political pulse last week. Him having the highest unfavourability rating was significant, but when we looked at where the movement was coming from in terms of the voting cohorts, he was actually stable with Labour supporters. So I think that's the difference between his unfavourable ratings of last week. He's keeping his support with those voters, but the quarter of Labour voters telling us they're disappointed in the government as a whole, I think could potentially cause them some problems, as that's the cohort who'll be interested in party conference that's coming up next week.
Stephen, what's your take as we go into party conference season of where the new government's at? Obviously very early days, but then negative numbers are never good.
Yeah, well, I think the interesting thing I think about your latest batch of numbers is that in terms of what you might think of as the decision architecture for the next election, for the government, you're thinking about 4 to 5 years ahead, they've landed the argument that it was the worst inheritance ever. That number's actually got worse for the Conservatives. But they've also landed the argument that they can't fix it, aren't fixing it, are bad at trying to fix it. Which, well, not even being optimistic, it's much easier to fix that perception of yourself when you are the government than it is for the Conservative opposition to fix the perception that it left a mess and the country in 2024 was in a bad state. That is a big reason why governments tend to be re-elected and oppositions tend not to be. I think the thing which, just looking at it as an analyst would concern me if I were a Labour strategist is going, okay, so yes, if we turn the condition of the public realm around, then suddenly all the polls start to look quite promising, right? Because that Tory perception is not going to change, and you can easily see how that perception of the government changes with delivery. But given that they've made quite a lot of promises on what they won't do on tax, Keir indeed made some more promises on what they wouldn't do on tax this week by going, well, I'm not going to do anything that hurts growth. And you think, okay, well, you're really relying quite a lot on the ability to get quite a lot more money into the public services, while, broadly speaking, not making most people notice that their taxes have gone up. I think the other interesting thing is, obviously, as you say, I think it's day 75 or something like that. I was talking to a former Liberal Democrats fan, as you'd expect, at the Dem conference. And they were talking about, they were saying, lots of these are mistakes we made, right? Getting in a mess over SPAD pay, there not being enough political heft in Downing Street. And they said, but we had kind of fixed most of those problems by day 100. I think the interesting question is at the moment, the Labour Party is not fixing those problems as quickly as the coalition did. But I think the interesting question is, on the 30th of October, do we look at them and go, you've sorted out your teething problems, you've made some big and controversial decisions that have turned things around in 4 years' time? Or do we go, oh, you're not waving the drowning.
Where do we stand on some of these stories about Keir Starmer freebies and sort of rows about Sue Gray's salary? These feel like Westminster bubble stories, but do you think there's any danger of some of this, I don't know, permeating into the public consciousness?
So I think they are important stories, but they're important for two very different reasons. I think the Keir Starmer freebie story is important because it looks grubby. I think it looks grubby, and I also think it looks ridiculous. I think most people, when they see a Prime Minister being given free clothes, being given free Arsenal tickets, and then saying, oh, well, if I didn't take these freebies, then I wouldn't be able... I mean, loads of people can't go and see Arsenal live. Going to see Arsenal live is really expensive.
Lots of people don't want to see Arsenal live, do they, Keiran?
I'm just asking the questions.
Yeah. Loads of... But, I think that stuff, which can make the government look sleazy and a bit ridiculous, is damaging in the long term. Because in terms of what I was saying earlier about, decision architecture, like broadly speaking, as we all know, if people think you are, people have to think you are competent for you to win their eggs. That's the first test of winning a vote or being trusted and taken seriously. So I think that stuff is really corrosive to the government's image. The Sue Gray stuff is ultimately a delivery story. The reason why this is provoking so much anger within the government is that for reasons that are not wholly clear to special advisors, people, many of whom took pay cuts to work for the Labour Party in opposition, received initial pay offers and asked them to take a further pay cut in order to continue on as SPADs. And obviously this being the Labour Party, of course, they've all joined the FDA, which is the union which represents SPADs, and also they have a WhatsApp group where they share pay offers. And the thing that a lot of them thought was they thought, well, this is annoying and stupid, but it's going to get fixed. I spoke to someone who, they were just like, well, they said at this point the government is apparently asking me to, just leave my child alone while I'm working until 9:30. Because I literally could not afford childcare and take a pay cut from what I was working for when I was working as a Labour SPAD. But this person was quite relaxed about this because they were just like, well, my minister's going to intervene on my behalf. It's annoying that I'm having to take the cognitive energy to think about it, but it will get fixed. And their assumption, and this was an assumption which was quite widespread among SPAD, was, the origin of this is someone in either the Treasury or in Downing Street wants a headline about spending money on less SPAD pay, which is why we're all being asked to take these. Either take no raise at all or to take a pay cut from what they were on in May. Then they see this story about Sue Gray being paid more than Liam Booth-Smith, her predecessor. I know that the coverage is mainly focused on the Prime Minister's salary, but to be honest, that's actually not the thing that is annoying SPADs. They go like, okay, but if I was being offered less money than my less qualified Tory predecessor, because obviously the nature of a government at the end of its life, you have a lot of not particularly qualified SPADs knocking around by the end. People working perfectly hard. I don't mean that remotely nastily, but just that's the nature of a government on its last legs. Them looking at that and going, okay, well, if I was being asked to eat a pay cut compared to my Conservative predecessor, why didn't the chief realise that this was a problem? And it feeds into that anxiety that is quite widespread among cabinet ministers and among SPADs, that there isn't political direction coming from Downing Street. And of course, if there isn't political direction coming from Downing Street, then everything else, budget, delivery, all of the stuff we're talking about is likely to be messed up as well. So really, I think the Sue Gray salary story matters as a canary in a coal mine rather than it mattering in of itself.
Yeah, and I think that as someone that does lots of focus groups, I think the freebie story feels like the thing that is not going to decide the next election. But if that's your criteria for just about anything, then 90% of what we talk about doesn't matter. Some may argue. But the freebie story feels like something you can imagine people in focus groups bringing up, that, politicians are always seen as on the take in inverted commas, so he's just like the others. And frankly, Keir Starmer, as you've identified, Holly, hasn't gone into this parliament with that great personal poll ratings. I mean, they're better than his Conservative opponents, but then once you become Prime Minister, that only matters so long. I mean, on the subject of sort of Westminster bubble stories, Holly, we've been doing some polling about Keir Starmer's missions, or Labour's missions, I should say. Did the public have a view on which of those are the most important?
The missions are an interesting one because we had the 5 steps to government and the steps towards the missions, and I think a lot of the language prior to the election was a bit muddled in terms of the public knowing what these things were going to be about. We're still also seeing that the public are a little bit confused about what the kind of the depth of the missions and what they entail. Some of them are quite vague and can kind of contain a lot of different facets of government. I think overall, when we look at things like our issues index, for example, and we see what the top issues are that the public want to be dealt with and are concerned about, things to do with the NHS, things to do with the cost of living, the economy, immigration. We did see a recent spike as well during the summer with the riots. And I think your point, Stephen, on delivery kind of is overarching in this. Whatever your missions are, unless you can convince people or kind of show people that you're legitimately able to achieve them, to tangibly improve their lives, you can have as many missions as you want, whether it's 3, whether it's 5, whether it's 10. They can be about all sorts of things. So I think what Keir Starmer and the Labour Party are going to need to do is put a bit more meat on the bones of those missions. Conference might be the opportunity to do that in order to turn this narrative, as you were talking about, Stephen, that's quite pessimistic at the moment in terms of all the things they can't do, are unable to do, don't have the money for. These missions are focused on things, on change. And that was what the Labour Party was promising when they won that general election. So being able to give some detail as to what those missions entail and how in the next 2, 3, 4 years, whenever the next general election is, they're going to be able to do that and be able to tangibly improve people's lives, I think are more important than what the missions themselves necessarily kind of say at the moment. But when you put these things in front of the public, people tend to be positive and relatively supportive of change and of things improving. It'd be a bit weird if they didn't, right? But they're not necessarily kind of well up on what they actually mean in terms of how it's going to affect their personal lives, I think.
And it feels like when you look at the polling, I mean, there's 2 things that stand out to me from the latest batch that we've put out there. The first is 55% of the public thinking things are heading in the wrong direction. I mean, it's a very pessimistic public mood. I know we know that, but still, it's worth reiterating that time and again. That figure was 62% before the election itself. Immediately after the election, it fell to 49%. Okay, so it's still around half, but it's ticking back up again. And I think part of that, I guess, is by design, some of the rhetoric coming out of the government. But, you know, there's a balancing act there, and I keep saying the same thing, between, you know, striking that balance between setting expectations as to the pace of change and how difficult it's going to be, particularly if you have in the back of your mind some of the difficult things you're going to do in the budget, but then reassuring people that change is actually coming at some point, because there is so much cynicism and skepticism about politics. You don't want people just to sort of shrug their shoulders and assume it can't be delivered. And I think on the missions polling, the NHS is so critical. I mean, it's not unusual for people to prioritise the NHS. Every election, it's somewhere in the top 3. But I do think the strength of feeling about the NHS and waiting times and GP appointments and things like that is really important, which makes you feel like, not that you can boil it down this way, like Wes Streeting's performance or the performance of, you know, his success as a cabinet minister is going to be really, really important. Let's think about conference itself then. I'll come to you, Stephen. What do you think the mood music is challenging, shall we say? What are they trying to get out of this conference, do you think, Labour?
I think it depends on who in the government you talk to. Every spending department, knowing that they have, I think, by the time this airs, they will have all issued their spending returns to the Treasury. Either they've said, look, here's how much money we think we need. The Treasury will have looked at it and gone. And what spending departments will want to do in these in their speeches is get either a form of words which makes it easier for them to argue for more money, or to throw their hats over the wall. Yeah. Okay, actually, to take an example of an already existing commitment, right? Labour's quite ambitious target on halving violence against women and girls. Now, obviously, that target doesn't come with an explicit pay rise. Sorry, that target doesn't come with an explicit budget commitment. But when we think about what a global and difficult problem, what is predominantly male violence against women and girls, has been to eliminate, we look at that and go, oh, that's probably a multi-billion-pound commitment. And there will be lots of things that cabinet ministers will want to say that they will then be able to use and go like, well, you remember how I said this in my conference speech? That means you have to give me more money. Or that means I can't possibly cut this. That means I can't possibly do without that. If you're the Treasury, your perspective in this conference will be to get through a conference without ministers saying anything. Downing Street at political cabinet, Morgan McSweeney said there will be no announcements at conference. Obviously, cabinet ministers have listened to that and gone,
well, I think I'm going to try and get an announcement at a conference.
Just a small one.
Just a small, just a
Sneak
little
one.
Just see. And so I think the interesting thing about conferences, I think actually, I think for many of us who commentate on politics, I suspect we actually won't enjoy this Labour conference very much, because I think a lot of activists feel that we are giving the new Labour government an excessively hard time. Mm-hmm. I think they actually will be in a bit of a party mood. They will be cheering and clapping whatever gets said on the conference floor. So there'll be a kind of party conference, but it'll be like a swan, because underneath every single speech, there will be this furious paddling between the spending department, the Treasury, and the Prime Minister will, I assume, have to intervene on some of those decisions one way or the other.
What do you think about Keir Starmer's speech? I mean, there's been a lot of debate, obviously, about are they overdoing the pessimism and the hard choices and this sort of thing? Should there be more sunlight, et cetera, et cetera? But what do you think the tone of that's going to be? How do you see that looking substantively?
Well, you'd assume that will be you'd assume there'll be at least two speeches to this conference and won't have announcements in, Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer. I think, the interesting thing is, if you look at some of the polls, actually, the public are telling us two different things, right? They're saying they don't think his rhetoric is pessimistic enough, but but clearly in some ways it is too pessimistic because his approval's collapsed. Mm. There is, just from a party management perspective, he's going to have to say something which gives MPs and ministers an understanding of what the roadmap is, right? In that they all know that the thing that Keir and his inner circle say is, look, I took over, I became leader, we made some difficult decisions, my approval rating collapsed, we trailed in the polls, midway through the parliament we turned it around, and at the end we won a landslide. And I think what he needs to do, more than show optimism, is have some collateral that leads to people to go, okay, I understand what it is we're about to do and why it might have the same effect on the opinion polls as... So, I mean, actually, if we take, say, winter fuel, which, I mean, one of the slightly funny things, I feel is the bit of polling that hasn't been allowed to intrude on any of our commentary is the fact that poll after poll shows it is a 50-50 proposition. Mm. Half of the country thinks it's a good idea. Unsurprisingly, as we all know, broadly speaking, if it's not the NHS and you ask the British public, do you think it should be means tested? They go, yeah, get me some of that means testing. You can see how by the end of the parliament, when there will be, bluntly, many more affluent pensioners than there are today, and the saving becomes quite significant, you can see how that is money that they could spend to get more votes, right? But between now and then, it's quite tricky for Labour MPs to see that. And also because there's no political frame to any of this beyond tough decisions. I think the thing he needs to do in the speech is basically start explaining what drives all of the tough decisions. What unites means testing the winter fuel allowance and the decision to use a pretty hefty chunk of their fiscal firepower on increasing the wages of public sector workers. He has to have a overarching story of what links all of that stuff, because one of the reasons I think why the government's comms are so flat-footed is ministers don't really understand why it is they are doing things.
Mm-hmm. Holly, you've been to a few party conferences over the last few years. What are you expecting from this one? What are you looking out for? This
one's going to be a really interesting one because Labour conference, certainly last year, I struggled to remember back 2 years ago, actually, a lot's happened since then. It was very optimistic. There was a sense that they were a government in waiting. It was a celebration. There were lots of announcements. There were all of these things they wanted to do. They've now got there. It's going to be interesting to see, as you said, Stephen. And the announcements point's fascinating, actually. I didn't quite understand how the speeches worked in terms of who was able to sign off what, and it will therefore be really interesting to see if people do make announcements that they're not necessarily supposed to make and commitments they're not supposed to make. I think the mood music's going to be fascinating. Is there still that optimism? They've just won a landslide. It's 3 months ago. They should be quite happy about that. They should be in a celebratory mood. But there are tough decisions, as Keir Starmer has said, and Rachel Reeves has said 75 million times in the past few weeks, to make. And I think the public and maybe the party currently are feeling that disconnect, as you say, Stephen. There are lots of tough decisions being made. They're being told they have to cut back on lots of things. They're not allowed to make many announcements. We're not hearing the other half of the story, which is why is that happening? What's the end goal? When is it going to get better? What is this going to achieve? So Keir Starmer's going to have a really tough job and Rachel Reeves as well, in selling that, I think, during a party conference when, quite rightly, the base are going to want to be celebrating the fact that they're back in government for the first time in 14 years and have won a massive majority. So it could be a conference of two halves, really.
Yeah, I feel like for me, the thing that, insofar as the media will ever agree on what the headline is, I'm looking for the headline of Keir Starmer's speech. Is it going to be, tough road ahead, or something that words to that effect, or is it going to be something a bit more bullish that says we will fix broken Britain or something? And like maybe being a question, some of the designs questionnaires, I've probably been a bit leading there in terms of what I think would work better. But there's a blend of toughness versus, like you say, that roadmap. Let's finish very briefly on the Tories. I know it's not Tory conference next week, but you can't really talk about Keir Starmer's approval ratings and the Labour Party's popularity without talking about the now main opposition. I mean, Holly, what do we think? What are we learning from the Conservative numbers, either the party or the leadership candidates?
Yeah, so the Conservative Party is still currently less popular than the Labour Party in terms of favourability ratings. Interestingly, the four remaining candidates as well for the leadership, their favourability ratings, it's around 1 in 5 are telling us that they're favourable towards them. About a third aren't. There are a lot of people in the middle who either don't know who these people are or don't have much of an opinion, and also a significant proportion of the country, when we ask them, saying they're actually not that bothered who wins. I know we've still got maybe a month to go until that person is elected, and it is probably difficult for them at the moment, having Rishi Sunak still currently there, still technically leading the party, but knowing that he's not going to take them forward, that those candidates will therefore have an opportunity at conference to kind of state their position, get the base on board, ultimately one of them to win, and it may give them a bit more direction. And I think given the Labour numbers we talked about at the start, whoever wins might therefore be sat there thinking they've got a bit of an opportunity given the direction of travel of the figures, both for Keir Starmer as Prime Minister and for the Labour Party as a whole.
Yeah, I think people shrugging their shoulders at you is not the worst place to be. I think
it could be worse.
I think the only leadership candidate that people had an opinion on at all was Priti Patel, and that was a negative one. I think a legacy of her time as Home Secretary. Stephen, 2 weeks away, but what's your take on where the Conservatives are at the moment in that leadership contest?
My take is, unless one of the other three candidates does a David Cameron, delivers a speech which completely changes the mood music around them, makes the party go, it wasn't just the content, but the way that Cameron essentially stood up and went, "We've been beaten, I'm your Blair," and turned that leadership election on its head. Unless one of them can do that, Robert Jenrick is going to become Conservative leader. I think that feels pretty likely, assuming nothing changes to shape the dynamic of the race.
What makes you think that? Because from an MP's perspective, he's ahead, but not miles ahead in the same way as previous elections.
So yeah, he's not miles ahead, but broadly speaking, although it is it's an oversimplification in terms of the individual politics of the MPs backing Mel Stride to see him as a candidate of the party's left, and it's an oversimplification to see Tom Tugendhat and James Cleverly as candidates of the party's left, and Kemi Badenoch and Robert Jenrick as candidates of the party's right. But for predictive purposes, it's a good enough rule of thumb. Essentially, the right's now voted, right? Yeah, there are no more right-wing MPs. There'll be some, but there aren't a significant number left. So that lead Robert Jenrick has over Kemi Badenoch is significant. Unless he unless he stands up, dribbles on his feet in his conference speech, he is not going to be overhauled by her. Whichever one of James Cleverly or Tom Tugendhat emerges ahead of one another at the end of the next round will get the bulk of support from MPs on the party's left. So I think it's very hard to see how Kemi Badenoch is going to finish in the top two. We know that she's the most popular candidate among Conservative members. So if she's not in it, then the contest becomes, harder to call. We know that Tom Tugendhat, broadly speaking, loses to everyone among Conservative members. And we know that Robert Jenrick versus James Cleverly is close, depending on the pollster and the method you use. So given, I would say, it's very hard to see, absent a shock, how Kemi Badenoch gets to the final round. Tom Tugendhat has a good chance, can't win. James Cleverly has a good chance, maybe can win. Robert Jenrick is therefore the person you'd most likely to be. And broadly speaking, that's the party. That is the message that parties always like best when they've just lost, is go, the problem is we weren't sufficiently ourselves. You know, like, you know, we just need to be a more, you know, and although he does this whole, look, oh, actually, in some ways I'm centrist. Look, I've got a sharp haircut. It's an appeal, you know, it's the Ed Miliband appeal. And there is a reason why that stuff usually works. But I think the interesting thing for me in terms of the polling is the next Conservative leader will be announced on the 2nd of November, which will be right after a quite painful and difficult budget. It feels to me a good rule of thumb that will be the most popular, because you are never more popular as a leader of the opposition than you are in your initial who's this bright new face period, then that will be the most popular the Conservative leader is. And given that we all know that the Labour Party is going to spend money in its final 3 fiscal... from 25-6 onwards, every single budget will be an expansive one. If the Labour Party is still ahead in terms of the Labour Party's popularity over the Conservatives, and Keir Starmer's popularity over Robert Jenrick, or whoever it is, then at that point, if you're the Conservative Party, you're basically just hoping for a geopolitical crisis.
Yeah. And the thing I was tweeting earlier, or ex-posting, or whatever it is these days, yo-yo between a bunch of forums, but the thing to keep an eye out for is Reform UK's numbers. I must admit I'd slept on those a little bit when we put our pulse out a couple of weeks ago. I think we were talking about this, Holly. Favourability towards Reform UK was at the highest it's ever been, 28%. It's not a great number. I mean, but 47% unfavourable, but that is the highest it's ever been. Unfavourability falling a bit. And so I must admit, with these declining approval ratings for Labour and for Keir Starmer, in my head I started to think, well, you know, 5-point swing, maybe a bit more. Maybe that creates a bit of a mess in terms of the next election result. Yes, there are people that say the Conservatives need a 12-point lead. I'm old enough to remember when people said that about Labour, so we'll have to sort of wait and see. But maybe all the dissatisfaction and pessimism that may or may not exist in a few years' time is further, I don't know, oxygen for Reform UK to do better. I mean, we'll have to sort of wait and see if Nigel Farage sticks the course, and what that then looks like in terms of an election result could even be even more confusing than the last one. Maybe the next election is both main parties losing support again, Reform gaining, but Labour maintaining a very chunky majority.
4 years to go, Keiran.
That is 4 years to go, and I think after a few months after the election, Holly, I think we should, relax a little bit, leave it there. But no, as ever, Holiday, thanks so much for joining me. Stephen Bush, as ever, always great to get your insight. That was the Ipsos Politics Talk podcast. Very big thanks to our guest, as I've just said. If you like what you hear, please do like and subscribe and tell a friend about us. But for now, stay tuned for more podcasts in the coming weeks.